Cameras flashed, champagne glasses clinked, and every guest whispered the same thing. That tonight was the kind of night people would sell their souls to witness. At the center of it all stood her, the billionaire's daughter. The kind of girl men chased like a fever dream. The kind of girl fathers prayed their sons would marry. She had the face of porcelain and the smile of a saint, framed by a dress worth more than most people's houses. 1,000 eyes worshipped her, and yet she felt as though she stood alone. Because tonight wasn't her fairy tale. Tonight was her prison. Across from her, dressed in a suit that still felt borrowed no matter how well it fit, stood him, her soon-to-be husband. He wasn't looking at her, not really. His gaze kept drifting. Over the chandeliers, the velvet curtains, the marble floor polished so brightly you could drown in it. He didn't see a bride. He saw a ticket, a key. For him, she wasn't love. She was escape. The vows rolled off their tongues like rehearsed lines. For better, for worse. Her voice trembled, soft as lace. His tone was steady, firm, but empty, like a man reciting a contract he had already signed in his head long before today. When the priest declared them husband and wife, he leaned in, kissed her lips for the world to see, and smiled for the cameras. And she smiled back, perfect, flawless, untouchable, but only she felt the coldness in his kiss. Their marriage began like a well-choreographed play. In public, they were perfection. At dinners, he pulled out her chair, brushed a hand against her cheek, whispered compliments that melted into the sound of crystal glasses touching. At galas, he stood tall beside her, hand firm at her waist, the picture of a devoted husband. But the doors always closed eventually, and when they did, silence filled the walls of their mansion. She played the perfect wife, smiling when people looked, keeping his schedule tidy, hosting charity events, wearing the right jewels, speaking the right words. He played the perfect liar, always working late, always tired, always gone before she woke up. She didn't need proof of his infidelity. She could smell it on him, the faint perfume that wasn't hers. But she never asked, never accused, never screamed, because silence, she had been taught, was the duty of women like her. Her heart, once soft and eager, slowly began to rot in that silence. To him, this was survival. He had been born into nothing, a home where the walls leaked rainwater, where dinner was often a stale piece of bread or nothing at all. He remembered the nights of hunger so sharp it clawed at his ribs, remembered watching his mother stitch clothes for rich women who wouldn't even look her in the eye. He had sworn then that he would never be poor again. So when her father extended a hand, when the contract was offered, their marriage in exchange for his escape, he didn't hesitate. Love had nothing to do with it. To him, she was a deal, a key out of poverty, a way to never taste hunger again. So he smiled at her in public, and at night he slipped into other beds, chasing women with fiery laughter and easy smiles, women who didn't come with diamond collars or watchful eyes, women who didn't make him feel small, standing beside all her perfection. He never noticed that she saw, that she always knew, because in his mind she would never leave. She was too loyal, too polished, too afraid of scandal. And so he thought he could keep lying forever. But she wasn't as fragile as he believed. Behind her diamond rings and soft-spoken charm lived a girl who had grown up under the shadow of wealth, knowing exactly how brutal it could be. She had watched business rivals destroy her father's friends, seen marriages collapse in firestorms of tabloids and betrayals. She knew the world she lived in wasn't built on love. But still, she had hoped. She had hoped he might see her. Not the billions, not the title, just her. Every night she prayed that his eyes might soften, that his voice might lose its sharpness, that one morning she'd wake up to find him looking at her the way she looked at him, with something real. But every morning was the same. Cold sheets, a space beside her pillow untouched, and every evening ended with the sound of the door closing as he left again, into the city night. Her hope began to fade. Her silence grew heavy, and her heart, once fierce, began to wonder if this was all she would ever be, the perfect wife to a man who never loved her. What neither of them knew was that their lies couldn't last forever. Wealth carries its own shadows. Power invites its own enemies. And one day soon, the girl he never loved might be the only thing standing between him and the darkness hunting him down. Because sometimes the woman you underestimate is the one who can destroy you or save you. Before we go deeper into this twisted love story, tell me in the comments, do you believe a marriage built on lies can ever survive? Like this story, share it, and let's dive in. Welcome to MG's Love Stories, where passion burns, hearts break, and you can't stop watching. Don't just listen, feel it. Like this story, share, subscribe, and let's dive in. Their marriage looked flawless on magazine covers. Every glossy photo painted the picture of a golden couple. Her in gowns that caught the light like 1,000 diamonds. Him with his hands steady at her waist. His smile sharp, his jawline harder than stone. Together, they were the story everyone wanted to believe. But stories on paper never told the truth of what lived behind walls. Inside their mansion, silence ruled like a third presence. Silence at breakfast, where her untouched toast sat beside his half-drunk coffee. Silence in the car, broken only by the hum of the engine. Silence in their bedroom, where she lay awake staring at the ceiling while he returned hours past midnight, the scent of someone else clinging to his skin. She noticed everything. The lipstick smeared faintly on his collar. The perfume that wasn't hers. The faint marks along his neck that she hadn't left. But she said nothing. Because saying something would make it real, and silence was survival. To the world, he was everything a husband should be. At her charity events, he spoke eloquently, telling the press how proud he was of his wife's dedication. At dinners, he leaned down to kiss her temple in front of cameras. His hands always knew where to fall, always careful to look tender, protective, loving. But the minute the cameras disappeared, so did the affection. He had grown so skilled at lying, he almost believed himself. Almost. He told himself he wasn't a villain, that he had been given a deal and he simply accepted it, that anyone in his shoes would have done the same. Marry wealth, escape poverty, leave hunger behind. He told himself she didn't need love. She had money, safety, status. Wasn't that enough? But when he slipped into other beds, chasing women with easier smiles and fewer expectations, part of him always felt the faintest sting of shame. A sting he buried deep, convincing himself she'd never know, because she was too good, too polite, too obedient to speak. He underestimated her silence. In her world, silence was its own cage. Every time she saw the evidence, her chest ached with a question she could never voice. Was I never enough? But in the mirror, she told herself the lines her mother once taught her. Smile for the world. Hold your chin high. You were born to carry the family name, not your own heart. So she smiled. She wore diamonds that weighed heavy on her hands. She attended galas where women whispered behind fans, some with envy, some with pity. And she stood tall, as though the silence at home didn't eat her alive. But sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and her chest too heavy, she'd walk barefoot into the dark kitchen. She'd sit at the marble counter, drink a glass of water, and whisper to herself, "This isn't forever. Can't be." She wasn't naive. She knew the truth of the world she was born into. Marriages were often contracts, not fairy tales. But still, she longed for him. For the man who held her hand in public, who kissed her before the cameras. If only he might one day do it when no one was watching. That longing kept her prisoner more than the marriage itself. He hadn't been born cruel. Poverty had sharpened him, hardened him, carved out every soft edge until only hunger remained. He had been the boy who stole scraps of bread to keep his younger brother alive. The boy who dropped out of school to shovel dirt for coins. The boy who learned quickly that no one gave you anything, you had to take it. So when the billionaire's daughter came into his orbit, she was never a person to him. She was opportunity. A door into a world where no one could humiliate him again, where he would never beg for scraps. But arrogance came with comfort. He began to believe he was untouchable, that she would always stay, that he could play the husband for the world and live as he pleased in private. And so he did, without hesitation, without guilt. until guilt began to find him in places he least expected, her eyes. It happened one evening, at a charity gala for children's hospitals. She was standing across the room, speaking to a young boy who had lost his leg. She knelt in her gown, diamond earrings catching the light, but her voice was soft, gentle, real. She laughed at something the boy said, touching his shoulder with care. And for a moment he saw her. Not the contract, not the daughter, not the deal. Just her. A woman who carried grace like armor and kindness like it cost nothing. Startled him. It made something unfamiliar twist in his chest. Something dangerously close to admiration. But the moment passed. He told himself it was nothing. He reminded himself of his hunger, his escape, his vow to never go back. And so, that night, he slipped into another woman's arms, trying to forget the look in his wife's eyes when she smiled at a child. But she wasn't blind. She saw the faint tremor in his jaw when he caught her laughing with that child. She saw the way he lingered a second too long at her side during the gala, his hand pressing firmer at her back. She saw, and for the first time, she let herself think, he's not made of stone. Maybe there's something human left in him. And yet, she didn't hope. Not anymore, because hope had betrayed her too many times. Instead, she began to build walls of her own. Quiet walls, invisible, strong. And the cracks in their facade grew wider. Whispers began to circle among their circle of wealth. Women at luncheons lowered their voices, speaking of the billionaire's daughter whose smile never reached her eyes. Men at cigar lounges wondered aloud why her husband seemed to spend so many nights away. Tabloids speculated, though never with proof. But in their world, image was everything. And for now, the image held. For now. Because beneath the surface, storms were forming. And soon, their fragile golden picture would shatter. If you were in her place, would you stay and protect your family's name, or walk away? Drop your answer below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more MG's love stories. Wealth was a double-edged sword. It bought silence, loyalty, beauty, and envy. But it also invited shadows. And in their world, shadows never stayed still for long. It began with a letter, folded neatly in an envelope, slipped beneath the heavy iron gates of the mansion. At first glance, it looked harmless, stamped with no return address, no crest. But inside, in ink as sharp as a knife, were only 5 words. We know where she sleeps. The butler found it at dawn. He passed it to her father's security chief, who slipped it into the billionaire's hand during breakfast. Her father read it once, face tightening, then burned it in the fireplace without a word. But words had a way of lingering even in smoke. That night, she felt the prickle of eyes on her when she stood at the balcony. The city glowed beneath her, but the dark streets seemed hungrier than usual. And for the first time, she shivered. The shadows grew bolder. A car that lingered too long outside their estate. A man in a black coat following her as she shopped with friends. Anonymous calls with nothing but silence on the other end. At first, she thought it was her imagination, that perhaps heartbreak had made her paranoid. But when she mentioned it to her husband in passing, his brow furrowed, not in irritation, but in concern. He brushed it off with a careless shrug, but that night he stayed home. For the first time in weeks, it unsettled him. He had always thought of her world as untouchable, her father's empire as ironclad. He had married into wealth thinking it would shield him from every wound, every weakness he had known as a boy. But now cracks were showing. And she was at the center of the target. For the first time, he saw her not as a contract, but as something fragile. Not fragile like glass, fragile like fire. Something that could be extinguished if he didn't protect it. He didn't know when his chest had started to tighten at the thought of harm reaching her. Maybe it was when he saw her on the balcony, arms wrapped around herself against the night air. Or maybe it was when he realized she hadn't flinched when she told him about the strange man following her. She wasn't afraid to protect herself. She was afraid for him. It gnawed at him. He had never asked to care. But caring was creeping in, uninvited. It happened 3 nights later. She was returning from a charity meeting, stepping out of her car at the estate gate, when a figure lunged from the shadows. A man in black, face half hidden by a hood. Her breath caught in her throat as he reached for her wrist. But before she could scream, her husband was there. He moved like fire, ripping the man away, fist colliding with jaw. The stranger stumbled back, hissing through his teeth before disappearing into the dark. Her husband stood, chest heaving, hands shaking with a fury she had never seen in him. "Are you hurt?" His voice was low, raw, nothing like the cold tones he used at dinner. She shook her head, though her pulse thundered in her veins. He stepped closer, fingers brushing her arm. Not for the cameras this time, not for show. His touch lingered, warm, trembling. And in that moment, the perfect liar faltered. Because for once, he wasn't pretending. After that night, everything changed. He no longer left the house without checking the locks. He sat at the edge of their bed until she fell asleep, then paced the halls when he thought she wouldn't notice. When they attended galas, his hand never left her waist. Not for show, but because he needed to know she was there. And she noticed. She noticed the way his jaw clenched when someone brushed too close. She noticed the nights he didn't leave, even when temptation burned in his phone with texts from other women. She noticed the shadows beneath his eyes, the way guilt and fear began to gnaw at the mask he'd always worn. For the first time, she began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was human enough to bleed. One evening, after another anonymous letter was found, this one with her name scrawled in jagged ink, she confronted him in the study. "You don't have to stay," she whispered. "This isn't your burden." Something in him snapped. "Don't you dare say that," he growled, stepping forward. His hands gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles white. "Do you think I could walk away now? Do you think I could?" He cut himself off, voice breaking. Her eyes met his, searching. "Why do you care?" He froze. The liar in him wanted to brush it off, to smirk and tell her it was nothing. But the truth pressed against his ribs, demanding release. "Because," he said, softer this time, "I don't know when I stopped pretending." The air between them thickened, hot and dangerous. His gaze fell to her lips before he forced himself back, running a hand through his hair. And for the first time since their wedding, she felt her heart stutter. Not with sorrow, but with something frighteningly close to hope. But hope was fragile, and shadows were patient. The men who threatened her father's empire weren't strangers. They were wolves, circling for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now they had found the weakness. Not the billionaire himself, but his daughter. The husband who had once seen her as escape now saw her as the only thing keeping him from drowning. But the wolves were closing in, and soon no walls, no rings, no lies would be enough to stop them. Do you think people like him deserve redemption? Or should he lose everything? Comment below. And if you're still hooked, hit like so more people can find this story. The city's elite gathered beneath chandeliers that dripped light like frozen stars. Gold cutlery glimmered, crystal glasses clinked, and the daughter of a billionaire moved through the room as though she were born of that brilliance. Her smile was flawless, her laughter perfectly pitched, and when she slipped her arm through her husband's, every head turned in admiration. The perfect couple, the golden pair, the fairy tale everyone else envied. But fairy tales rot in silence. He leaned close when no one was watching, whispering a venom she disguised as a blush. "Smile wider," he hissed. "You're slipping." And she did, because that was her role. To smile, to shine, to hold the mask. But masks grow heavy. That night, as applause rang for speeches she could barely hear, she caught it. One woman's knowing glance across the table, a smirk that cut sharper than any knife. She followed the trail of that smirk to her husband's hand beneath the table, brushing against a thigh that wasn't hers. Her jaw locked, the mask cracked. For a second, only a second, her smile faltered. And the room noticed. Whispers carry faster than wildfire in gilded halls. She felt them crawling around her, serpents of curiosity and hunger. The perfect wife unraveling. The perfect husband, exposed in shadows only she could see. That was the first crack in the glass. And glass, once cracked, never mends whole. When they left, The city's night air wrapped cold around them. He was drunk on laughter, on the taste of perfume that wasn't hers. She was quiet, too quiet, and silence is a dangerous thing. The house greeted them with its usual emptiness. Lights blinking awake in perfect order. But at the doorstep, something waited. A single red rose, the stem cut too short, its petals already wilting. He bent, frowning. "Who leaves this kind of thing?" he muttered, but his voice wavered just enough to betray unease. She said nothing, only watched as he pocketed it, pretending it was nothing at all. But roses are never just roses. Not when their thorns are dipped in warning. That week, the shadows thickened. Calls came with silence on the other end. A figure lingered too long across the street. A car trailed his longer than coincidence would allow. And one morning, taped to the glass of his office, he found a photograph, his face circled in red. He ripped it down before anyone else could see, buried it beneath paperwork, as if paper could smother fear. But she noticed. She always noticed. And that night, she spoke the words he didn't expect. "I know you're in trouble." His head snapped toward her, eyes sharp, defensive. "Stay out of it." But her voice didn't waver. "I won't. Because when whatever this is finally reaches you, it won't just be you it destroys." For the first time he saw it, steel beneath her silence. Not just the perfect wife. Not just the contract he signed with a smile and a lie. Something stronger. Something dangerous. The darkness was coming. And he was beginning to realize she might be the only thing standing between him and it. The mansion was too quiet that night. Silence has a way of pressing on the walls of a house, of curling itself around its residents until every breath feels like an intrusion. She lay awake in the bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her hands resting against her stomach as though she were holding something fragile there. Her husband hadn't come home yet. That in itself was not unusual. He often found excuses not to. But tonight, the silence hummed differently. The city seemed restless. Even the night had a pulse. When the door finally opened, it wasn't with the drunken stagger of a man who had spent himself in pleasure. It was sharper, heavier, as though he carried a weight that no glass of liquor could drown. He didn't speak. He only stripped off his jacket and tossed it across a chair before sinking into the shadows by the window. She didn't ask where he had been. Wives who ask too many questions in houses built on money seldom like the answers they hear. But she felt it in her bones. The air was different. Something had followed him inside. Something unseen but watching. It began the next morning. The newspapers arrived at the mansion gates before dawn. By 8 o'clock, the staff whispered, and by 9, her father had already called. "Control him!" The old man snapped down the line, his voice cold enough to frost glass. "Or I will." On the glossy pages of the society columns, her husband's name stretched like a crack in marble. Photographs of him, laughing in places he shouldn't have been, with women he should never have touched, spilled across ink and paper. He hadn't been careful this time. Or perhaps he had been careful, but someone had been watching. Someone wanted the world to see. She read it in silence, her hands steady, her expression as smooth as the pearls at her throat. A perfect wife doesn't break. Not even when her marriage is paraded like cheap scandal before strangers. She knew her role. Smile, stand tall, let the rumors roll like waves over stone. But inside her chest, something shifted. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. Something that waits. That evening, her father invited them both to dinner. It was not a request. It was a summons. The restaurant was carved in glass and gold. The kind of place where the chandeliers looked like frozen constellations and every waiter moved like a ghost. Her father sat at the head of the private table, flanked by men whose smiles never reached their eyes. Beside them sat another, unknown to her, but not to her husband. The man in silk. That's what she called him in her mind. His suit fit like it had been stitched by the night itself, black and sleek, with a tie the color of blood just beginning to dry. He had the kind of face that didn't age, the kind that could belong to a king or a criminal depending on how the light hit it. When he spoke, his voice was smooth enough to coat glass. "You've been reckless," he said, his eyes cutting to her husband with the weight of quiet judgment. And recklessness leaves debts unpaid. Her husband stiffened, but covered it with a smile. She saw his hand curl against his thigh under the table, saw it and said nothing. The man in silk raised his glass, but his words were knives. I hear stories of you, friend. Stories of women, of cards, of secrets. You run fast, but the shadows run faster. I only wonder, when they catch you, will your wife still stand beside you? Or will she be smart enough to step aside before the darkness swallows you whole? The table chuckled politely, but no one laughed. Not really. She sipped her wine, her expression porcelain. But her heart beat once, hard, like a warning bell. She didn't confront him that night. She had learned long ago that silence was sharper than shouting. Instead, she moved through the mansion like a ghost herself, watching, waiting. It was 3 nights later when she found it. He had fallen asleep in the study, a glass of half-finished whiskey at his side. Papers sprawled across the desk, careless in their chaos. She wasn't looking for anything, not truly, but something called to her, the way danger sometimes whispers your name. A letter, folded, creased, its edges burned slightly, as though someone had tried to erase it from existence. The handwriting was not his. The words were brief, but enough to drain the blood from her face. You took what was not yours. You lied once too often. Now the debt comes due. You can't hide forever. She held the paper with trembling fingers. For a moment, she thought of waking him, demanding the truth. But then she looked at him, her husband, this man who had turned her into a prop, who thought of her as an ornament rather than a person, and she folded the letter back into place. She would keep the secret, but not for him, for herself, because knowledge is power, and she was tired of being powerless. That night, as the mansion slept, she stood by the window and stared out at the city, lights flickering like 1,000 watchful eyes. Somewhere out there, shadows were closing in on her husband. And maybe, just maybe, they were closer than he thought. The perfect wife had played her part long enough. The silence that had once been her cage was beginning to sound like opportunity. And in the darkness beyond the glass, the wolf in silk was smiling. The house held its breath after the storm. Rainwater dripped from the eaves, making a slow, steady music like the ticking of an anxious clock. Within, the air was heavy with secrets. Some spoken, some only thought, but all of them circling like restless ghosts waiting for a crack in the walls. He sat at the dining table, his jaw clenched, a half-empty glass of whiskey sweating in his palm. The night before, his rage had thundered through the halls. Yet in the morning light it had retreated into silence. Silence more dangerous than words. His wife moved about the kitchen, cautious as though each step might awaken a sleeping beast. She had seen him angry before, seen him drunk, even seen him cruel. But this quiet weight was something else. It was as though he had swallowed his own fury and it was chewing at him from the inside. Trouble often slips in through the smallest crack. He was on the veranda that afternoon, speaking low into his phone. His voice carried a note she had never heard before, fear. Not rage, not lust, not the iron command of a man who thought the world his to own, but something brittle. No, you listen to me, he hissed into the receiver. I'll have the money by Thursday. I said Thursday. You come here before then, and it won't end well for you. He ended the call with a violent jab of his thumb. What he did not notice was that the driver was near enough to hear, crouched by the Range Rover, polishing its tires. And drivers, as everyone knows, have ears longer than they let on. By nightfall, the words had traveled from the driver's lips to the housemaids, from the maids to a neighbor's cook, and from the cooks to the ear of a cousin in the market. And in a town where rumors breed faster than rats, by morning there was already talk. The man in the fine black coat owes debts, big debts, and not to kind men. When his wife stepped out to buy vegetables that day, she caught a glance from 2 women by the stall. The kind of glance that lingers a second too long. Whispers followed, thin as threads but sharp as knives. She didn't ask what was said. She didn't need to. The village air itself carried it. That night she served him dinner, her hands steady though her heart was not. "Is everything all right?" she asked, as though the question were casual. His eyes flicked up at her, cold and swift. "Why do you ask?" "You seem restless," she said. He smiled, but it was not a smile that reached his eyes. Restless men are men who are alive. Better restless than buried. And with that, he returned to his plate. She said nothing more, but her stomach coiled with unease. The wife had lived many years pretending not to see what she saw. The perfume on his shirts, the lipstick stains on collars, the missing hours explained with clumsy lies. She had built for herself a mirror that showed only what she wished to see. But now cracks spread across that mirror. She began to notice things she could no longer ignore. The men who came at night, their knocks sharp and urgent, their voices hushed but angry. She would wake to find him speaking with them in the study, his voice low and sharp, words like shipment and balance and threat. She saw the way he carried himself now, as though hunted. He flinched at sudden noises. He double-locked the doors, checked the windows twice before bed. And then there was the letter. One afternoon, when he left his jacket draped carelessly across the chair, she found an envelope in the pocket. She should not have opened it, but curiosity is stronger than obedience, and fear stronger still. The letter was short, written in a blunt hand. "You think money buys time. It doesn't. Thursday or we collect another way." No signature, only the crude drawing of a knife. She folded it back quickly, her hands trembling, her breath caught in her throat. She wished she had not seen it, but once truth touches the eyes it cannot be unseen. That evening she studied his face at the table. The fine cut of his jaw, the proud set of his brow, features she had once adored, features that now seemed carved in stone. He noticed her gaze and raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "Nothing," she said too quickly, but she could not look away from him. She saw not a husband, not even a lover. She saw a man dragging shadows behind him, shadows that now crept into her house, her life, her children's future. That night, as he slept heavily beside her, she lay awake. Her mind replayed the whispering women at the market, the letter in his coat, the strange men at the door. For the first time, she felt not only anger at his betrayals, but fear. The knock came just before midnight. Not the polite knock of a visitor, not the hurried knock of a messenger, but a slow, deliberate pounding that carried its own authority. He rose from bed at once, his face tightening. "Stay here," he told her. But she followed quietly, her feet soft against the tiles. Two men stood in the doorway, tall and sharp-eyed, dressed in plain clothes that did not hide their menace. They stepped inside uninvited. "Time's up," one of them said. His voice was calm, which made it more dangerous. "I told you Thursday," her husband replied, his voice low but edged. "Thursday is for men who still have choices," the other said. "You don't." The wife's breath caught, but she dared not speak. She watched from the corner of the hall, half hidden in shadow. Then came the words that turned her blood cold. "There's another way," the first man said, glancing briefly toward her. "Your wife is respectable, trusted. If she puts her name on the papers, the shipment clears. No one asks questions. One signature, that's the bargain." Her husband's jaw clenched. "She knows nothing of this." "Then teach her," the man said flatly. "By tomorrow." They left as silently as they had entered, but their absence felt no lighter than their presence. The wife stepped into the hall fully now, no longer willing to pretend she had not heard. "What papers?" she asked. Her voice was steady, though her hands were not. He stared at her, his eyes dark with something she could not name, shame, perhaps, or calculation. "You don't need to know," he said finally. But she did know. She knew enough. Enough to understand that his sins were no longer confined to women's beds or whispered rumors. They had grown claws and now reached for her name, her life. That night she stood at the window long after he had gone back to bed. The rain had returned, tapping against the glass like an impatient guest. She thought of leaving, of taking the children and vanishing before the storm swallowed them whole. But where would she go? What power did she have against men who moved in shadows? Men who drew knives in letters? And yet, another thought came, sharp and defiant. Perhaps the true danger was not the men at the door, but the man in her bed. The days that followed were taught with silence. He moved through the house like a man carrying a bomb inside his chest, and she moved like a woman standing too near the blast. The rumors outside thickened. Some said he was ruined already. Others said he had powerful enemies, men who did not forgive. And always the whispers about his wife. Does she know? Will she stand by him? Or will she be the first to fall? And thus the tale deepened, not with shouts but with silences. For silence, when it stretches too long, speaks louder than any confession. It came on a Thursday evening, folded neatly into an envelope without a sender's mark. No seal, no crest, no trace of handwriting. Just his name, sharp, deliberate strokes that made his stomach knot when he first saw it lying on the marble console by the door. He waited until she was upstairs before tearing it open. The card inside was simple. We know who you are. We know what you've done. Midnight, the old theater. Come alone. No threat, no demand, just certainty. A statement of power that rattled him more than 1,000 curses could have. He crushed the note in his fist, chest tightening. For years he had walked among titans, politicians, businessmen, men who smiled over wine and slit throats with contracts. He thought himself untouchable, hidden behind her father's empire and the image of a dutiful husband. But now the veil was slipping. Someone had peeled back the layers. Someone had been watching. Upstairs, he heard her laughter, light, practiced, floating down the staircase like a sound from another world. Once, he might have been soothed by it. Now it felt mocking. Did she know? Had she seen the cracks in his facade and invited the wolves herself? At dinner, she glanced at him over her glass of wine. Her smile was faint, unreadable. He wondered if she sensed the tremor in his hand as he set his fork down. By the time the clock struck 11, he had already made up his mind. The car idled in the driveway, black as night, waiting to swallow him whole. He slipped on the mask he had worn so long, the calm, confident grin that never faltered. But inside, his thoughts were a storm. The old theater waited for him. The shadows were calling his name. And for the first time, he felt not like the hunter, but the prey. The theater sat like a carcass on the edge of the city, its once grand facade now rotting under the weight of time. Columns cracked, posters faded, windows blind with dust. Yet tonight, a single light burned above the entrance, pale and steady, like an eye that had been waiting. He parked 2 streets away and walked the rest, coat drawn tight around him, every echo of his footsteps sounding like a gunshot in the silence. The air smelled of mildew and rain-soaked concrete. His hand brushed the cold steel hidden beneath his jacket. His oldest companion, polished and loyal. If this was a trap, he wouldn't go down unarmed. Inside, the theater was a tomb of velvet and cobwebs. Rows of seats hunched in darkness, and the stage curtain hung heavy like a shroud. Only a single chair had been placed in the middle of the stage, illuminated by a lone spotlight. On the chair rested another envelope. He climbed the steps cautiously, scanning the balconies, the aisles, the shadows where a rifle barrel could gleam. Nothing moved, yet he felt the press of unseen eyes. The envelope contained a photograph. It was her, his wife, smiling, radiant, but not as she smiled for him. She was in someone else's arms, caught in an intimacy raw and unfiltered. His jaw clenched, his pulse roaring in his ears. On the back of the photograph, for words were scrawled in crimson ink. She knows everything now. A sound rippled through the theater then. Not applause, not footsteps, but laughter. Low, mocking, spilling from the shadows above. He turned sharply, weapon drawn, but saw nothing except the dark swallowing itself. Then, a voice. Smooth, familiar. You built an empire of lies, and thought no one watched. But every hunter leaves tracks. Every shadow tells a story. Tonight, yours ends where it began. The spotlight above him dimmed, leaving only darkness. And he realized with sudden clarity, this wasn't just about betrayal. This was judgment. The silence after the voice was heavier than a tombstone. He kept the pistol raised, finger tense on the trigger, but the dark swallowed everything. His heartbeat felt like a hammer against his ribs. Then a figure stepped into the thinning light at the far end of the stage. Tall, calm, dressed in black. The face was obscured beneath the brim of a hat, but the presence was unmistakable. This was the puppeteer who had been pulling strings from the shadows. "You should have stayed buried in that alley," the man said, voice rolling like oil. The husband gritted his teeth. "And you should have stayed dead in the past." The figure chuckled, as if they were discussing weather. Still quick with the bravado. "But bravado won't save you. She knows now your wife. She knows everything you've done. All the bodies. All the nights you thought no one would notice." The husband's grip on the pistol tightened, but his mind snagged on the words. "She knows." His throat went dry. The photograph burned in his pocket. "You're lying." "Am I?" The figure tilted his head, the faintest smile cutting across the shadowed face. "Check your phone." The man's free hand fumbled for his pocket, pulling out the device. His thumb trembled as he swiped, and there it was, a video. Her face filled the screen, his wife. Her eyes were swollen from tears, voice shaking but resolute. "I know who you are now, what you've done. Don't come home. Not ever. We're finished." The phone slipped from his hand, clattering against the stage floor. Screen cracked, words still glowing. The gun in his hand suddenly felt heavier, useless. The figure in black took a step closer. "See? Even love has abandoned you. You're a man with no country, no family, no mask left to wear. And I..." He spread his hands, smile widening into something feral. "I've come to collect the ruins." The husband lifted the pistol again, aiming dead center at the intruder's chest. His voice was gravel. "Then come and take them." The theater went silent again, air thick with a single question. Who would make the first move? The two men froze, statues carved in shadows. The pistol trembled in the husband's grip, but his eyes were ice. The intruder tilted his head, amused. "Still aiming for the chest? You never did learn." Bang! The husband fired first. The sound shattered the silence, echoing through the hollow theater like thunder. The bullet tore into the velvet curtain behind the figure. He had sidestepped at the last instant, coat flaring like wings. And then the world exploded into gunfire. The intruder drew a silenced pistol from beneath his coat and returned fire, each shot snapping past the husband's head, splintering wooden seats, shattering forgotten chandeliers overhead. The husband dove behind the orchestra pit, breathing hard, bullets tearing the dust around him. His ears rang. He peeked over, fired twice. Glass shattered, sparks spat from the old lighting rig above. The intruder advanced slowly, like a predator, boots echoing on the boards. "You can't hide. Not here." This stage was built for tragedy. The husband rolled out from cover, sliding across the dusty floor, firing 3 quick shots. One grazed the intruder's arm. He staggered, cursed, then fired back with fury. The bullets slammed into the wooden stage, sending shards flying like knives. They circled, ducking behind rows of broken seats, firing in bursts. The theater was a war zone now, dust clouds glowing with muzzle flashes, every corner alive with echoes of death. The husband's pistol clicked empty. His stomach dropped. He fumbled for a fresh magazine, hands trembling. The intruder smiled coldly, advancing. "Out of bullets already? You disappoint me." He raised his silenced pistol, aim steady. But the husband, desperate, slammed the new magazine into place with lightning speed and fired blind through the armrest of a seat. Crack! The intruder grunted, stumbling back, blood blooming across his coat. He dropped behind the curtain, vanishing into shadow. Silence. The husband stayed low, smoke curling around him, pistol still raised. His breath came in ragged gasps. The theater reeked of gunpowder and blood. But the fight wasn't over. He knew it. Somewhere in the shadows, The enemy was still breathing, still waiting, and the next move could be the last. The theater had emptied into ruin. Smoke curled like restless spirits in the rafters, and the stage, once meant for art, was now littered with broken bodies, shattered seats, and the blood of men who'd thought themselves untouchable. At the center of it all stood her, the billionaire's daughter, no longer just the wife who smiled on cue, no longer the fragile doll dressed for gala lights. The shadows had carved her into something else entirely. Her silk gown clung to her frame, ripped at the seams, but her eyes had hardened into glass and steel. He was there too, the husband who'd once seen her as nothing more than a ladder rung. A man who thought lies could keep him safe, thought betrayal had no cost. His breath came ragged, his arm bloodied from the fight, and still he had that smirk, that arrogance. But the tables had turned. The gun in her hand didn't waver. She had learned too much, lost too much, to tremble now. Around them, the last of his enemies groaned where they lay, their empire collapsing in fire and silence. He looked at her then, not with love, never with love, but with something he'd never shown her before, fear. You wouldn't, his voice cracked. You can't, but she could, because she had been underestimated for far too long. Every lie he fed her, every night he slipped away, every time he mistook her silence for weakness. It had been fuel. Now it burned in her veins. And as the gun's hammer clicked back, the theater seemed to hold its breath. Because this wasn't about love anymore. This wasn't about escape. This was the endgame. And in the end, mercy was not hers to give. The gun felt almost weightless in her hand, though the moment carried the gravity of a collapsing world. Smoke swirled above them, firelight flickered against the stage curtains, and every shadow seemed to lean closer, waiting. Her husband staggered back a step, blood seeping through his sleeve, arrogance cracking under the weight of her silence. For the first time in his life, the smirk faltered. You wouldn't, he whispered, eyes darting between her face and the gun. You don't have it in you. She inhaled slowly, the acrid air burning her lungs. But her heart didn't race, not anymore. Something inside her had already crossed the line hours ago, maybe years ago, when the lies first took root. She remembered every humiliation, every betrayal disguised as charm, every time he had reduced her to an ornament. She remembered the faces of those who had paid the price for his greed. And most of all, she remembered that the woman he thought he owned was gone. The trigger moved under her finger. "Watch me," she said, her voice a blade in the silence. The shot thundered through the theater, echoing off broken chandeliers and cracked marble. His body jerked, the smirk vanishing forever, before he crumpled onto the blood-stained boards of the stage. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the flames seemed to bow in respect. Her grip loosened. The gun dangled at her side. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She only stood there, staring at the body of the man who once thought himself invincible, and felt the weight of freedom settle heavy and sharp in her chest. The empire was ash. The lies were finished. There would be no curtain call. The theater still smoldered, smoke curling through the ruined velvet drapes, glass crunching under her boots as she walked. Each step away from the body felt like a lifetime unshackling itself. But then, a cough. It was faint, ragged, but unmistakable. She froze. Slowly, her gaze slid back across the stage. His body twitched. Blood pooled dark and wide, yet his chest rose, shallow and stubborn, as if refusing to let go. Her heart lurched, not with pity, but with rage. She had pulled the trigger. She had ended it, and yet he clung to life. Then she noticed something she hadn't before. His hand wasn't reaching for her, nor for the gun. It was clawing at his coat pocket. With trembling fingers slick with blood, he pulled free a crumpled photograph. One of them together, long before the rot set in, back when their smiles weren't masks. But behind the photograph was something else. A key. Not the one she knew, not the one he had used to build his empire of lies. This one was smaller, older, worn with time. Her breath caught. The key she had been chasing all along wasn't the only one. From the shadows of the balcony above, slow applause broke the silence. A voice, smooth, mocking, all too familiar, drifted down like smoke. "You really thought it ended with him?" She turned, gun snapping upward, her pulse hammering, because standing there in the flicker of firelight was the one person she never thought she'd see again. Alive and smiling, the figure descended the balcony steps slowly, each clap echoing like a taunt against the ruined theater walls. She didn't lower the gun, though her hands trembled under the weight of it. Not from fear, but from the sick recognition that curled in her chest. "You," she whispered, her voice ragged. The firelight revealed a face she had buried in memory long ago. A face she had grieved. A face that was supposed to be dead. Her sister. The sister who vanished years ago. The sister who had been whispered about in alleys, blamed for betrayals, written off as a ghost in the game of power. Yet here she was, whole, smiling. "You were so busy chasing his lies?" the sister said, tilting her head toward the bleeding man on the stage. "You never once asked who placed the key in his hands in the first place." Her throat went dry. The pieces she had fought to assemble suddenly shifted into a new picture. The Empire, the shadows, the betrayals. It had never been just him. It had always been them. Her sister's smirk softened, almost tender. "You killed the wrong monster, little one." The weight of it hit her like the recoil of every bullet she had fired tonight. Rage and grief tangled into a storm inside her chest. The theater crackled with flames creeping higher, threatening to consume it all. Her sister extended a hand, palm up, as though inviting her into the inferno, into the truth that had been hiding all along. For a long moment, she didn't move. The gun hung heavy, her breath sharp in the smoke. Then, she stepped forward, placed the gun into her sister's open hand, and whispered, "No more." Her sister blinked, surprised. But before words could form, the fire roared, swallowing the stage, the bodies, the photograph, and the keys alike. They walked out together into the night. Behind them, the theater collapsed in a storm of sparks and ash, and with it, the story that had bound them. The curtain fell. Weeks later, she sat by the riverside at dawn, watching the current carry away the charred fragments that once defined her life. The empire was gone. The theater, gone. The man who had chained her to lies, gone. But her sister remained. Not an ally, not an enemy. Something more dangerous. A mirror. For the first time in years, she let herself breathe without the weight of vengeance pressing her ribs. Freedom felt strange, almost foreign, like stepping barefoot onto earth after a lifetime of stone. She didn't know if she had chosen wisely that night in the theater. She only knew she had chosen, and sometimes that was enough. The city whispered new stories in its smoke-filled alleys. Rumors of sisters who had walked away from fire, who had left a kingdom of ashes behind them. Some said they vanished into exile. Others said they built something new. She never corrected them, because her story wasn't for the city anymore. It was hers, and maybe yours. If the story gripped you, don't let it vanish into the smoke. Hit like, tap subscribe, and join me for the next descent into shadows.